All right. So after George Washington came, anybody know? I just mentioned him at the end of the last piece. So it's this guy, John Adams, which I actually have John Adams earrings because I'm what you would call hardcore and super cool. So George Washington's departure. I'm sorry, one of my cats is playing with a toy. If you hear jingling, that's what it is. George Washington's departure unleashed fierce party competition over the choice of his successor. John Adams won the most votes and became president. Thomas Jefferson came in second and therefore won the office of vice president. Because that's how it worked back then. First place, president; second place, vice president. The Adams presidency was beset by crises. On the international front, the country was nearly dragged into an ongoing European war. Due to a poisoning of relations, France and the U.S. were engaged in a quasi-war at sea in 1798, with French ships seizing American vessels in the Caribbean and a newly enlarged American navy harassing the French. In 1800, Adams managed to negotiate a peace with France. Domestically, things were far worse for Adams. A brilliant but stubborn and self-important man, Adams, along with his Federalist Party, were confronted by mounting opposition, some of which voiced by immigrants. Federalists moved to silence their dissent with the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. As you've read, I hope, the Alien Act allowed the deportation of persons from abroad deemed dangerous by federal authorities. The Sedition Act, which was set to expire in 1801, when Adams hoped to be reelected, authorized the prosecution of virtually any public assembly or publication that disagreed with or was critical of the government. The passage of these acts launched what Jefferson called the Reign of Witches, with 18 individuals were charged under the Sedition Act, 10 of which were convicted. Jefferson and Madison mobilized opposition, who drafted resolutions adopted by the Kentucky and Virginia legislatures. The resolutions attacked the Sedition Act as unconstitutional, in violation of the First Amendment. Horrified at the idea of state actions endangering the Union, no other states endorsed the resolutions. However, the broad revulsion against the Alien and Sedition Acts greatly contributed to Jefferson's election as president in 1800. Okay, so just to go over this briefly. The Alien Act. You can deport anyone who came from abroad if they're deemed dangerous by federal authorities. Well, what constitutes dangerous? In this case, it's people with a different political opinion than you. And it's very broad and very vague and very problematic. The Sedition Act broke up newspapers, assemblies that disagreed with or criticized the American government. This is also extremely dangerous and in clear violation of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, right, in the First Amendment. So just be aware of these, because there's always debate over how far to let free speech go. There's free speech versus hate speech, which, criticizing the government for doing something is far different than saying something extremely hateful, malicious, or threatening about a member in the government. That tends to be curtailed by federal authorities. However, just openly criticizing or disagreeing with the government is part of free speech. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were very dangerous to First Amendment rights in 1798, and I just want you to be aware of that and all the implications. And when you have one side deciding what is dangerous and what is critical, it can really cause problems, as you saw for these 18 people, 10 of which were convicted. So, as you can see, Adams' presidency does not go super well. Enter this guy. Due to a crisis in which Jefferson and Aaron Burr were tied for the presidency, Congress adopted the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, requiring electors to cast separate votes for president and vice president. So that's how you have now separate tickets for president and vice presidential election. They don't run just all for president, and first and second get the posts. Alexander Hamilton tipped the scale in Jefferson's favor when the tie went to the House of Representatives and Jefferson became president. Jefferson hoped to dismantle as much of the Federalist system as possible. Among his first acts as president was to pardon all those imprisoned under the Sedition Act. During his 8 years in office, he reduced the number of government employees, slashed the Army and Navy, abolished all taxes except the tariff, and paid off part of the national debt. Which usually, abolishing taxes and paying off national debt don't go well together, but Jefferson managed it. Jefferson's Republican presidency was juxtaposed by the Federalist Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, in the case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803. The details are outlined in your textbook. With the case, the Supreme Court had assumed the right to determine whether an act of Congress violates the Constitution, a power known as judicial review. Also in 1803, Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory. Jefferson purchased the land for $15 million. Okay. So Jefferson purchased the land for $15 million. Think for a second. I know you have access to the notes, and they're probably in front of you right now, but just think about what that might mean in today's money. It's the equivalent of perhaps $250 million in today's money, making the Louisiana Purchase one of history's greatest real estate bargains. You got all of that land, for what would today be $250 million. That's incredible. Incredibly cheap. In a stroke, Jefferson had doubled the size of the U.S. and ended the French presence in North America. Knowing his transaction was, quote, an act beyond the Constitution, he still believed the benefits justified the transgression. Incorporating Louisiana into the United States would not be easy. Native Americans, free persons of color living under Spanish and French rule, and whites not previously under the sovereignty of the U.S., suddenly found themselves in American territory. French and Spanish persons of color and women enjoyed greater status than those in the United States. Women, for example, were able to hold on to the principle of community property under U.S. rule, which they had had under the French and Spanish rule, but the status of free blacks plummeted. For enslaved blacks, a sweeping slave code declared that they could, quote, never consider themselves the equal of whites. And after Jefferson came this guy, James Madison. Jefferson's hand-picked successor and fellow Virginian, James Madison, was the next president. After mounting pressures from Britain and France's return to warfare, Madison reinstated a trading embargo with Great Britain in the spring of 1812. The growing crisis between the U.S. and Britain took place against the background of deteriorating Indian relations in the West, which also helped propel the U.S. to war. This is important, and I will give more details in a minute. Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana reinforced policies of Indian removal. The period of 1800 to 1812 was an age of prophecy among the Indians. Movements for the revitalization of Indian life rose among the Creeks, Cherokees, Shawnees, Iroquois, and other tribes. Some believed Indians could retain their autonomy without engaging in violent confrontation with whites. Others, like Tecumseh, a member of the Shawnee, delivered a more militant message. Tecumseh, who had refused to sign the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, and his brother, Tenskwatawa, a religious prophet, who called for a complete separation from whites, led a revival of traditional Indian culture and resistance to federal policies. Tecumseh sought to revive Nealon's Pan-Indian Alliance of the 1760s, which we talked about. Reports that the British were encouraging Tecumseh's efforts contributed to the coming of the War of 1812. In June, with assaults on American shipping continuing, Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war. The bill passed, making the War of 1812 the first time the U.S. ever declared war on another country. In retrospect, it seems remarkably foolhardy for a disunited and militarily unprepared nation to go to war with one of the world's two major powers. And with the expiration in 1811 of the Bank of U.S.'s charter, the federal government found it increasingly difficult to finance the war. Before the conflict ended, it was essentially bankrupt. In 1814, having finally defeated Napoleon, Britain invaded the United States. Its forces seized Washington, D.C., and burned the White House, while the government fled for safety. This was also the first and only time the United States was invaded by another country. Like the War for Independence, the War of 1812 was a two-front struggle against the British and against the Native Americans. Tecumseh was commissioned as a general in the British Army and led pan-Indian forces against the U.S. in 1813. He was defeated and killed at the Battle of Thames near Detroit. So that's important, two-front struggle. In 1814, Andrew Jackson led a force of pro-assimilation Creeks and Cherokees, defeating hostile Creeks in Alabama. Jackson then moved to New Orleans in early 1815, where he engineered the war's greatest American victory. A number of political careers, including Andrew Jackson's and William Henry Harrison's, flowed from American victories in the War of 1812. With neither side wishing to continue the conflict, both parties signed the Treaty of Ghent in December of 1814. News of the treaty did not reach America until after the Battle of New Orleans had been fought. The treaty simply restored the previous status quo with no territory changing hands. Considering that the war had not been a military victory for the U.S., the Treaty of Ghent was about as good an outcome as could be expected. The war completed the conquest of the area east of the Mississippi River. Never again would the British or Indians pose a threat in that region. It also broke the remaining power of Indians in the Old Northwest and significantly reduced their holdings in the South. These defeats opened up land to American settlers. In its aftermath, white settlers poured into Indiana, Michigan, Alabama, and Mississippi. Additionally, for not supporting the war and other reasons including elitism, distrust of popular self-government, and others, the Federalist Party ceased to exist only a few years later. And that is it for the early republic and the War of 1812. Next week we're going to get into a lot of really interesting stuff, including the market economy and the market revolution and the growing of technology in the U.S. So very cool stuff. So hopefully with this slightly shorter lecture, the idea is that you will devote more time to discussion, not just your own post, but those of your peers as well. And we will talk more again next week with growing economies and claiming spaces.